Welcome to this panel on the economics of spectrum. So 30 some years ago, the FCC revolutionized spectrum management by introducing auctions. That innovation moved us away from comparative hearings, better known as beauty contests, and lotteries for assigning licenses. These were key in creating a vibrant cellular wireless market, stimulating innovation and generating hundreds of billions of dollars in revenue for the Treasury. We've also seen tremendous innovation in auctions themselves, becoming more sophisticated and used in clearing and reallocation, in addition to allocating already available spectrum. They're so significant that the FCC was effectively part of the Nobel Prize in economics won by Paul Milkman and Bob Wilson a few years ago. But auctions only come into play after key decisions are already made through administrative processes. And if that decision is that the spectrum should be used for exclusive licenses, with some exceptions, auctions are part of CBRS. That is, the commission still has to decide whether the spectrum will be for exclusive licenses, unlicensed use, or some type of sharing. That decision, which fundamentally shapes markets, remains a beauty contest, with stakeholders lobbying and submitting competing technical reports. That leaves us in the position of really not knowing what the best spectrum allocation should be and how to make sure it remains optimal in the future. A good example is the current notice of inquiry, in which the FCC will decide the fate of the C-band. Advocates for different uses are preparing their arguments and reports, as they should. In other words, it will be a beauty contest with all the inefficiencies that come with that. This challenge of making foundational allocation decisions through administrative processes isn't going away or getting easier. And as spectrum demands grow and uses diversify, the pressure increases to find better ways to make these allocation decisions. And today we'll explore how economic principles might help, examine new market mechanisms, metrics for comparing different approaches, and frameworks for incorporating various policy goals. We have an excellent panel of distinguished experts, each with long experience in spectrum and the FCC to tackle these questions. I'll just introduce them very quickly, and then we'll get started. So we have today Evan Kwerel, who is the Senior Economic Advisor at the FCC, Ruth Milkman, who is a partner at Quadra Partners, Mike Ostrovsky, a professor at the Stanford Graduate School of Business, Greg Roston, Director of Stanford's Public Policy Program, and Gordon Kane, Senior Fellow at CEPR, and Paroma Sanyal, Principal at the Brattle Group and Co-Chair of their Telecom Media and Entertainment Practice. Now for the audience, feel free to type questions into the Q&A, and we will do our best to answer them. Thank you all for joining us, attendees and the panelists, of course. Thank you for being here. So let's start off with Ruth. As the non-economist on the panel, could you help set the stage by discussing the sort of essential legal, institutional, and other baseline elements that are kind of necessary as table stakes if we want to treat spectrum as a property right? Basically, what are the foundations necessary to allow market mechanisms to work in the first place?
Thanks, Scott. So I'm going to betray my age. And of course, Evan is even older than me, so he remembers this well.
So you just betrayed Evan's age.
I did. But when I started doing spectrum work, it was flexible use policy was not a thing. And I would argue that the flexible use policy, that is the concept that you don't designate spectrum for taxi cabs or forest use, but rather you make it flexible within certain parameters. It's fixed and mobile, or it's terrestrial, or it's satellite. That might be the most important market-based mechanism out there. That is what allows spectrum to be repurposed, and both in terms of technology advances, but also in terms of different types of uses. And along with flexible use, if you're going to have spectrum be more like property, you need renewal expectancy. That is, you need the licensee to assume that it will hold the spectrum for a defined period of time, long enough to make the investments. And you need them to be able to transfer the spectrum. You need them to be able to divide it, partition it. All these things go along with a flexible use policy. And I'll just stop there.
So I was going to jump in with, because I was going to say the exact same thing, that auctions weren't the most important thing in the mid-90s. It was the move to flexible use. We have, spectrum is scarce because of, there's a limited bands that can be used for certain things, and the flexibility to make it used more efficiently is really the way we want to allocate things and try to figure it out. as much as possible. The best auction would be one with perfectly flexible licenses that raised $1, didn't raise billions of dollars, because that would mean that spectrum wasn't a scarce resource. The problem is that we don't have enough bands available and enough ways to get them out, so the price is high.
Evan.
So first, I needed a disclaimer that these are my personal views and not those of the FCC. So I just want to add one characteristic to the ones that Ruth mentioned as needed for a property rights approach, and that's exclusivity. Without exclusive rights, you don't really have a property right, and and auctions and markets are not going to work. The second thing I'd like to say is I want to give a shout out to John Williams, who really was instrumental in the efforts to go to flexible usage rights. I mean, when John Williams came to the commission, when John Williams came to OPP, he had been, prior to that, he had been in the engineering office and the head of the spectrum allocation division, and he concluded that there wasn't any rational way for that to work, and he was then became on a mission to apply markets to the management of spectrum, and we teamed up together, and well, anyway, I could speak more about that, but let me just give one example that PCS and broadband PCS was originally thought of by the Office of Engineering and Technology, that it should be limited to something, a very narrow purpose, like these handy phones in Japan, where you'd have like wireless points where you could use your phone. And John in particular, and then John and I working together, said no, it should be flexible use. But OET thought, well, we already have an allocation for cellular. Why do we need another one? We should have it for some other specific purpose. So this was a big deal. And another thing I just want to mention is, in thinking about flexibility, there's both use flexibility and technical flexibility. And a great example of the benefit of use flexibility is the fact that spectrum that was used largely for mobile use is now being used to provide fixed broadband by mobile providers. And the technical flexibility, I think, the most important example that I can think of has to do with the technical standards for mobile use. Whether it was CDMA or whatever, 2G, 3G, all these things. It did not require the FCC to determine what the technical standards would be, and it resulted in great innovation in the United States. So, I mean, that's something to keep in mind. Both the use flexibility and the technical flexibility have led to great value added.
That was something that you and Ruth will remember, was the FCC refused to issue a statement on flexibility in 1996. Oh, I think it was 1997, and it ended up coming out as a working paper because there were not enough commissioners willing to vote saying flexibility is a good thing. So it ended up that Jeff Steinberg and I ended up issuing a working paper that was basically a commission statement, but not enough votes. There were kind of one vote each way, and the chairman said, all right, we'll just put it out and ignore the other commissioners. So flexibility is a good thing among economists, but not necessarily among broadcasters or other people at the time. Hopefully they've come around.
Well, so how has that that view of flexibility change. Some would argue that different approaches to spectrum sharing allow even more flexibility. Others would say not. What have we learned from different sharing models about this, about market mechanisms?
So I think, Scott, going back to your and Ruth's point on property rights and the beauty context aspect of it, when I think about sort of this property rights, I think about it as sort of a bundle of rights along various dimensions. And as Ruth sort of pointed out, it could be along frequency, it could be power, it could be geographic, it could be a whole host of things. But where on the line you are, whether more towards exclusive sharing unlicensed, a lot of that, I think, is still determined in more of a beauty context kind of way. And I think for economists, thinking about how to quantify what goes into at least making that decision of where on the line the allocation will lie, for me is sort of the really interesting question here.
So this may be a good place to go to Mike, where you have an interesting paper which tries to use market mechanisms to make that decision, or at least to decide among a couple of different options. Tell us a little bit about that.
Oh, yeah, sure. And thank you. I'm a bit younger, so for me, actually, the path towards the FCC auction, I learned about them in college, and it was just blew my mind that the first FCC auctions just happened. And in particular, what was amazing about them is, as you mentioned, and some of you made happen, you replace something that was done by administrative hearing with participants kind of putting their money behind what they're saying. And then it was really fascinating to observe it over time, where some of the same principles started getting applied to the supply side and not just on the demand side. So, the incentive auction being one of the fascinating examples, where instead of deciding in advance how much spectrum to clear, the FCC developed this wonderful procedure for endogenously deciding, how much will be repurposed. And so what my piece proposes is that we can continue going down this path to also make it possible to incorporate into the market mechanism the decision of how exactly to slice and dice the spectrum. So in particular, we obviously have a well-established model of, and Evan mentioned exclusivity of exclusive use of spectrum. But in recent times, we also had new models like CBRS, where instead of getting rights to a dedicated chunk of spectrum, you get some slightly more vague rights to an amount of spectrum, but the specific frequencies may change with the demand of whoever supplied the spectrum, so they don't have completely clear it. So the model of the shared spectrum. And then the natural question is, how do we decide between the two, right? And that's sort of, as of right now, that's still done, administratively. And what my paper suggests is that that can also be incorporated into a market-based mechanism. And roughly speaking, in just kind of a couple sentences, the way you would do it, you can run sort of two auctions in parallel, one in which participants would bid on under the assumption that the spectrum is completely cleared and sold off on the exclusive model, and the other one where it's sold under some other model. It could be CBRS or it could be some other innovative approach. And for each one of those, and we can talk about that as well, the seller, the DoD or the government would put some number how much it costs them to clear that spectrum. And for one of the mechanisms, for one of the auctions, it's going to be much more expensive than the other. And so these two would run in parallel, and whichever generates the higher surplus relative to the very different clearing costs would then determine whether the spectrum is shared, is sold using the shared model or using the old style exclusive one.
So can I ask you a question, Mike, on this?
Sure.
Yeah. So this is kind of, the way I think of it is not like open access model for one versus exclusive license for the other. It's kind of two different scales of licenses where you have an exclusive license. Is that kind of how you're thinking about it?
Yeah, so it can actually be applied to pretty much any two mutually exclusive options for selling spectrum, right? So option A
Can I
can
interrupt here?
absolutely, please.
Yeah, so when you say selling spectrum, that's the point. So it does, if one of the options is to have, unlicensed spectrum, this is not going to work. Because you can't sell unlicensed spectrum. So if in CBRS, we made it all, unlicensed, managed on a commons basis, free entry, then, you'd get no revenue, but doesn't mean that there's no value.
Yeah,
So
no,
really,
that
and some of CBRS was on an unlicensed basis.
So Evan, can I stop you right there? CBRS, the GAA is not unlicensed. It's licensed by rule, and there isn't unlimited
No, I
ability to
know
get
that.
GAA.
You're right. You're absolutely right.
But you're right. Your fundamental point is right. If you tried to do this on unlicensed, it wouldn't work.
yeah. So I think that's a super important point. I mean, an even bigger example is Wi-Fi, right? So that's sort of government revenue from that, and the economic value of that is in trillions of dollars. So a couple points on that. So one is you can still use this approach when both mechanisms generate substantial revenue, right? So CBRS still generated a substantial amount of revenue because one part of this was sold. The other one is that you can, it would require a bit more work from the government, right? They would already need to determine clearing costs, to estimate clearing costs, which is an important exercise. They could likewise put some dollar value on, estimate the value of the spectrum that doesn't generate any revenue, right? So in the case of CBRS, the government could say, okay, here, there is GAA, here is our estimate of how much value it generates. And, now that we've had the first CBRS style auction, we can actually run some analysis to try to estimate that. And then you would add that handicap on one of the options, right? So you wouldn't just look at the clearing cost, you would look at the clearing cost plus kind of the government estimated revenue value of the free option. So, you could in principle incorporate these types of considerations. I think the basic point is that instead of the government just deciding A or B, they sort of decide, we prefer A by $25 billion, whether for clearing reasons or for, the types of reasons that you're mentioning, and then let the market participants decide whether one of them will outbid the other by that delta, by that handicap.
So is that kind of like we're quantifying the beauty contest a little bit?
Yeah, so I think that's right. I think that's exactly right. So basically, we move beyond just us deciding completely which option is better to saying, okay, we prefer this option by this delta, which in the basic proposal could be just clearing costs, but you can also, and of course, lobbying will shift to that. But I still think it's a step forward.
I agree. So, but can I just put a sharper point on what it does? The way I would describe what it does is it determines the difference in value to commercial users of the two options. That's what it's doing.
That's correct.
There's two options, and you find and you have an auction that says how much is it worth to the commercial users in one option versus the other option, and it's the difference that matters.
I think that's right. I mean, commercial.
And then there's all these other pieces of it. So I mean, that is a useful piece of information, but there are all these other pieces in making this decision that relates to Scott's original point of how you determine this and to what extent can you put it into a market process. And I think a big piece is coming up with the sharing mechanism. I mean, that is just absolutely critical, and I mean, this compares two options, but how are those options determined? And I don't have an answer to that, except that it's a complex, technical, administrative, political process. And let me say one other thing about this. CBRS was a particularly simple sharing arrangement. I mean, the nature of the sharing and the interference are just quite simple. I mean, it's the notion that, you know, there are these radars, and when they're turned on a certain channel, you can't operate there, so you move to another channel, and that's it. And in essence, the PALs, the priority licensed, whatever it is.
Priority access licenses.
Yes, the priority access licensees essentially have exclusive licenses. For all practical purposes, they have an exclusive license. It's just not necessarily on the same channel, but they're close together, and they have devices that are indifferent among the channels. So it's an exclusive use.
Another part of that, and we talked about it a little bit before the panel started, was that it'll reveal how much different participants in the dual auctions value these different approaches. But then the decision, the winner is determined, the clearing cost play a large role in determining who the winner will be. And the clearing, there are incentives, DoD has incentives to say that the clearing costs are very high. Are there ways to deal with that issue, or do we end up just backing up the lobbying and the technical reports to what people say the clearing costs will be?
Scott, I think one thing that we might want to think about is the benefit side, and whether if we take into account the entirety of benefit side, both sort of, you know, the private and the non-private values, whether that is greater than even whatever the DoD wants to put on the table in terms of the clearing cost and how that plays out. Because typically, you know, with the 3.1, what we've seen are enormous clearing costs being put on the table. And if you just go beyond auction revenues and look at a lot of the non-private values that sharing often comes with, that might put a thumb on the scale for the administrators for one versus the other mechanism.
Right. I mean, any approach will have other non-private values, and that's a, you know, what are the sort of, how do we take that into account? Because there are all kinds of social values, social value that aren't going to be included in private valuation, including national security, which is always used as an excuse for whatever it is anybody wants to do. They'll say we got to do it for national security reasons. Is there a way to incorporate that in some kind of coherent framework into these decisions?
So I don't know if it's coherent,
No.
but I'll start. You know, first, one of the other things, you know, we never in auctions, you know, we kind of assume there's competition, so we don't worry about consumer surplus, even though certain services have more consumer surplus than others, and we don't have a way of in general in the marketplace overall. We don't, you know, we allocate resources based on willingness to pay for them by the producers. For the national security considerations, you know, I very much want us to think about how to do that, but we, you know, this is going to sound, you know, simple to everybody who's thought about it, but hard to implement, which is we buy all sorts of things for national security. We buy the radios that use the airwaves. We pay the people who are the radio engineers. We buy the airplanes that these systems are put into. All these things are done using money, not administration. We don't mandate that Boeing make planes for us. Maybe that's a bad example. But you know, these things are things that we definitely, you know, kind of have in the market. And is there some reason why we can't, you know, we can't use the market to do it? You know, that's the simple economist view of things, but I know it's more complicated than that, and I just want to at least put that out there.
Yeah, well, I've been dealing with that for like almost 40 years, and I've pretty much given up on this because, you know, given our legal structure, which I have great respect for, there isn't a way, and it's not just the legal structure. There isn't a way for the government users to express evaluation the same way that private sector people can, because of the fact that they can't keep any of the savings from conserving on spectrum and use it for some other purpose. I mean, it's just not, so they have no incentive. They have no incentive to conserve on the spectrum, and there's no way to give them an incentive that I've ever been able to come up with.
I mean, I think it should be generally you'd think, the same thing would be true of office space in Washington, D.C., but they actually pay for that. There is an opportunity cost, but the FCC, if it uses fewer offices, doesn't get the benefit by having more money in its budget because it cut off 100 offices.
Yeah, but GSA, is the one that's supposed to, balance those things and squeeze us. And,
right.
And Congress is supposed to do that with DOD, and you see how well that works.
Right. I mean, there's, so there's something else going on, but it isn't, the government does, respond in some ways to some of these things in, things that are not spectrum.
But these are kind of two separate, these are two sides of the question, right? One is, if we were starting from scratch, how should DOD get spectrum? And the other is DOD has this spectrum. What do we do about that? Right.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I think the DOD people would say, they wouldn't say this, but they're thinking, if I give up 5 megahertz of spectrum now, even though I know I can conserve on it, what happens in 5 years when somebody needs to put in a new system and I've been the person who's given it away? They don't
can't buy it back.
Yeah, no, I agree,
Well,
but they wouldn't
yeah.
have the budget to do it. They would worry about it, and this is a way of keeping it and keeping their budget.
And sometimes their risk averseness is right. So in the late 1980s, when the Soviet Union collapsed, there was a thought that we wouldn't need NATO spectrum anymore. And we, looked at, should we go after spectrum that was used for NATO? And we didn't get very far, but I think that's probably a good thing, since it turned out that NATO, there was a reason for the continued operation of NATO and a continued use of common spectrum.
So given that, we have so much incumbency sort of in the current spectrum scenario, especially with DOD, does that push us more towards a shared scenario, whatever the sharing mechanism is going to be?
Can I ask a question about sharing? Whatever that is supposed to be, besides Citizen Broadband Radio Service, CBRS. What other examples are there of some new approach to sharing? I mean, we've been doing sharing between sharing in some definition between the federal government and commercial users forever. I mean, the sharing means, and by that definition, it's these different uses on the same band, and it's often geographic separation and microwave systems that you can separate and so on. But besides CBRS, which is always given as an example, and I argue that it's a particularly simple example, what other sharing mechanism is there between that's in some sense innovative, between the federal government and commercial users?
Well, does it have to be just federal government and commercial, or could it be commercial, like automated frequency control and 6 gigahertz, or dynamic frequency selection and 5 gigahertz?
I'm talking
or
about
white
the federal
spaces.
government.
So I don't know whether it's innovative, but the 3.45 with its geographic licensing, right? With the protected areas, that allows for sharing.
But we've been doing that forever, as far as I can tell, have exclusion zones.
They have dynamic
Yeah. exclusion
zones now. I mean, I think that might be the difference in 3.45, though I don't know how well they work. In other words, you can have fixed exclusion zones, and then they have dynamic protection areas where you can sometimes use the spectrum and sometimes not, or the commercial user can sometimes use the spectrum and sometimes not.
So, I'm not going to come up with an example, but I have a market mechanism that might work. We did the incentive auction, and that was the right way to do it. And I think that I'm going to argue the overlay licenses would have been a bad way to go about that. However, now we have a whole bunch of TV spectrum, which I doubt we're going to have another incentive auction, which is going to have the FCC play the central role that it played in the incentive auction. But overlays in the rest of the TV band might give flexibility and might lead us to see what commercial innovations there might be in sharing spectrum or dynamic reallocation of spectrum between TV stations and terrestrial broadband use or something else. And I think the FCC should investigate or move forward on overlay auctions for the rest of the TV band, so that we get that we release this spectrum. It might make Tom Hazlett extremely happy to do that, but it probably, my guess is it probably won't raise a whole lot of revenue, because the ability to do the sharing and other stuff is a ways off. But it would, as I said, the more important thing is that people would now have an incentive to actually start working on doing deals with TV stations in congested areas and trying to figure out ways to use the spectrum.
So I'm going to have a slightly non-answer answer to Evan's question about other examples. So it's not surprising that CBRS was, as you mentioned, multiple and particularly simple. So whenever we try new things, we usually find kind of the lowest hanging fruit, the simplest examples. And it's hard for us to imagine what could happen going forward. What I like about, and part of the reason why I'm enthusiastic about this kind of dual track auction, is that it's a very sort of robust, I think, and natural way to investigate new options, right? So suppose 5 years from now, someone comes up with a totally novel, very different type of sharing proposal, and the FCC is not sure how much demand there is for something like that. So they could run a dual track procedure where option A is just standard, whatever, bread and butter, tested way of selling the spectrum, and then option B would be these whatever this novel sharing approach is, and then the market can say how much they value this new sharing approach. So you kind of, instead of the government trying to predict how well a particular type of sharing will work, you, just like the original FCC auctions, you offload this investigation work on the companies, and then they will kind of reveal preference, will tell you how well this will work. But I'm totally with you that CBRS was a very natural place to start exploring these types of things.
Hey, Evan, what's your current thinking on spectrum fees for government users? Or maybe maybe that's an unfair question.
You mean as a way of providing incentives?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is an old chestnut, and call me a curmudgeon, but I asked what's his name, Caves,
Martin
Caves. Yes, because there's also a Jonathan Cave or something, but it's Martin Caves about this, and he was instrumental in developing the fee structure and the whole approach. And he somewhat jokingly said the only one who's really benefited from that is me. I mean, it really made no difference in terms of providing incentives for I mean, maybe at the margin, at a very small margin, but there's no evidence that at the level of fees that they were able to establish. And
This is in the UK.
in the
you're talking about?
UK,
Yeah, but
No.
but he also said they set the prices way too low, is what he thought.
right, I said at the level that they.
Yeah, right. No, I just want to be clear what you said.
Right, and so I don't know, and you know, then it becomes that the agencies have to get appropriations to pay for the fees, and you know, it just becomes a political process. I mean, it gets down to the same basic point that their budget is determined, you know, by Congress, and you know, if you save money by giving up spectrum, you know, you save so you don't pay the fee, then what happens? You get your budget cut. So do you want to do that? I mean, it just that's the fundamental problem. So I'm not all that enthusiastic. I just don't see it as an answer. I mean, sadly, and I say sadly because as I said, I've spent a career trying to, you know, expand the role of markets in managing spectrum. So it's not that the only thing that I've seen that's really successful in dealing with the federal government is Congress saying, hey, you've got to, you know, give up this amount of spectrum. And you know, then kicking and screaming, they do that and, you know, and come up with high cost estimates, and there's all sorts of negotiations about that, and you know, in areas where they don't give it up and have some form of sharing, you know, it's usually geographic, you know, exclusion zones, and that's how it works, and it's unfortunate that it's all a political negotiated process, but I haven't seen anything else that works. So you know, if somebody's aware of something that's worked in another country or someplace, I'd like to know what it is, but I've knocked myself out trying to come up with things, and they always come down to the fact, what are the incentives of the government agencies, and that they just you can't create, given our system, and given, you know, you can't create the right incentives for them.
Well, so let's say that that's a hard constraint. That is the way it is for now. What's the best way? How can we maximize some measure of market approaches subject to that constraint? Is it the sharing models that we've been trying?
I think simple as it may be, the CBRS model, of course, it was the first in its sort of sharing regime, has had a fair amount of success in terms of usage, and you know, the new users who've come into the market who have tended to use it. And to me, a lot of this needs to be looked at from how we quantify some of these externalities when we are thinking of sharing. That is not just auction revenue, or not just sort of you know, the private values of either the MNOs, but it's more about bringing in new users, bringing in more competition into the market, thinking about, you know, the cable companies being able to use like the cheaper shared spectrum, and maybe providing more competition in the mobile sector. So a lot of these, I think, need to be considered when we are thinking about sharing.
And do you think that those same that there are not externalities with exclusive use also? If we're going to try to do that, take that into account?
So by its very nature, it's only the MNOs using that particular slice of spectrum, right? So when I think about sort of the externalities, it's outside of sort of the MNOs and the other users. And I think this is where it nicely fits into what Michael was talking about. There are these other sort of users who have value in the spectrum band. It could be, your cable companies. It could be sort of the John Deeres of the world. So they also have value, but it's outside the optimization that the MNOs are going to do. So there are these different providers who will have value, and taking all that into account, I think, is important.
So if an auction is efficient, then the John Deeres that use cellular or exclusive license spectrum, is that taken into account in the auction revenues, or what we measure by the auction revenues then? I mean, I guess I think, I mean, it seems like there are externalities on in many types of use, and we should absolutely take those into account. But again, I don't know that we've thought through all of those and how to measure them.
And I think that goes to the point they made earlier about different consumer surplus that people get from watching television versus having broadband. Consumers have different consumer surpluses in these different cases. I was going to make a different point. An interesting thing that kind of caused me to think about this is, we should try with these shared licenses to have incentives built in for the licensee to say, hey, at the margin, can we negotiate with the Defense Department to give us a little bit more, not just a one-shot deal of here are the parameters at the start, but to say, let's negotiate because we have a lot more demand in a certain area than we thought. And one way to do it is to go onto the market and buy other spectrum. Another way is to get the government to kind of release its constraint in this area, or do something else, and to try to make sure that a licensee has the right incentives and the ability to negotiate, and then would benefit from it.
So what can they give the federal user in exchange for whatever, this greater flexibility or expanded rights or something? How do they compensate the federal user?
So maybe it's with newer equipment that is better, something like that,
But I don't think that they can do it, outside of the context. The Ruth, correct me on this, but my limited understanding is that the compensation for the federal users has to go through that. I forgot what the name of the legislation was that provides for compensation for federal users. But you can't. I don't think a private party can just negotiate with DoD and give them better equipment. I think everything has to be done through that legislative vehicle.
Well,
Stevens was the one, we used to call it Stevens Act or something.
The Spectrum Relocation Fund?
Yes.
Is that what you're talking about?
Yes, that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, but is it possible? I think Greg is asking an interesting question. Could it be, if it's the same entities in two different places, could they potentially trade greater constraints in one area for lesser constraints in another? Could the commercial licensee trade that? Then there wouldn't be any money changing hands.
And I was ignoring the law, trying to say, maybe the law could be changed to do that. That's, we're not talking, just what can be done today, but maybe something, and that might be in the Defense Department's interest to allow that as well, if they think they can get more out of it. That might not be something that they might not stonewall as much.
I would like, I like the idea, but every time I've touched anything with this, it's like, you're bumping up against like the Anti-Deficiency Act. I mean, that you can't expand, your budget outside of an appropriation. Everything I have touched, with dealing with the federal government and trying to use markets, founders on all these rules. I mean, I hate to be so negative about it, but I've hit my head against a brick wall for so many years that it's kind of sore.
But you did break the wall occasionally.
Yeah, but not with that. That is a big area that I've not made any progress on. I just have been failed completely in that area.
And that's why I think it's actually a good idea always, even if you're looking at government spectrum, to simultaneously look at repurposing commercial spectrum. C-band NOI is a good example of this.
Absolutely.
But there are other bands as well, and it's much easier to apply commercial incentives to market incentives to them.
But there again, there's there are legal constraints in terms of how you use markets there.
Sure.
So let's take we have some questions here. Let's go to a few of them. Let's see. This is from Hector Lopez, I believe at NERA. Hopefully I got that right. If not, I apologize. He asks, can we use market mechanisms based on congestion pricing to tackle allocation of shared resources? Shared spectrum is akin to a shared road. There's free entry, exit, and behavior that affects others. The right congestion price could support efficient allocation.
Yeah, I mean, Peter Crampton argues, that we should, use some kind of, congestion pricing, for doing these things. And, I think it's an interesting idea. I mean, I think, one of the questions would be in doing that was, who would be the entity that would run such, a pricing scheme, and what's the legal authority for doing that? I mean, I think in principle, yes, you could allocate, technically assign spectrum, on a short-term basis, based on congestion pricing. But one, I don't think we have the legal authority to do it. And two, would the FCC, run that, or would they have to have a private party that, that would do it? And how would that work? But yeah, I think the answer is yes in principle.
I mean, I will add a little bit to that. And again, I don't know the legal constraint, but in principle, you could do it with some existing bands where you will just, with already existing property rights, you introduce some kind of short-term trading mechanism where, the current participants can exchange spectrum on a short-term basis. I mean, they already do some of that, right? So the spectrum is being leased, so you can just sort of make it easier to do it on a faster basis. So it doesn't have to be run by the government. It's just we have to have the right frameworks to be able to do it kind of in near real time.
And I think that, I think that private companies do this. The cellular companies have resale agreements where people who pay less on different plans get deprioritized.
That's right.
And so they're essentially doing it on not, and that, when their data gets a little slowed down, that is on a real-time basis. The pricing isn't on a real-time basis, but
Right.
the allocation of spectrum is.
That's
And,
right.
they're doing it, it would be a lot harder to say, do you want to, what's your willingness to pay at any point in time, but you just buy a better package.
I mean, they could,
Really care.
all I'm saying that pricing could in principle also move to real time.
Yeah.
I don't think there are any fundamental barriers against that, unless there are some legal issues that I'm not aware of.
Let's take another question from Fernando LaGuardia, who at one point was at Time Warner Cable when that was a thing, and then has been at American University and then general counsel at AmeriCorps, I believe. So he knows telecom and institutions. He asks, says government agencies could be incentivized to use their spectrum more efficiently if they're given no year appropriations into which savings could be collected to be used for purposes that benefit the agency's mission. And over time, Congress could adjust the availability of those funds. It would require cooperation from appropriators. Has that been attempted?
I don't know if it's been attempted, but if I were at the Defense Department and you told me that you could put money in an account for me that I could then use, I would say no. Because I would think that Congress is just going to, if you put $1 $1 billion into an account, I would think that Congress is going to give me $1 billion less over the lifetime of that for something else. And so, yeah, in principle, it sounds great, but in practice, I think if I were at the Defense Department, I would not be happy with this answer.
Yeah, I agree with Greg, and you know, one of the sad things about incentives in many government agencies, or most, is you always spend all your money. I mean, if you end up spending less than the money, then the appropriators will say, well, you didn't need all that money, so we're going to cut it. So you know, people try to rush to make sure that they spend everything. That's success. The program was a success. We spent all the money.
Seems like it can be cut these days before the time has even run out. So this, since we're coming up to the end, let's go into one last issue. And we've been bumping up against this throughout the conversation. So Ken Arrow's impossibility theorem is that there's no such thing as a true democracy because somebody always has to make a decision, whether it's what the voting mechanism is, what the agenda is. And the same seems to be true in Spectrum. At some point, there has to be an administrative decision. Somebody will have to make a decision onto how something is going to work. How far back into the process can we take market mechanisms? I mean, are we bumping up against that barrier, maybe with the Defense Department? Where is, I'm not even sure exactly how to think about it, where this point might be. We just know that at some point, administrative decisions will have to be involved, even in the utopian market mechanism society. That's not really a question, but
It's just a statement. So as the non-economist on the call, I'll say, even when you're talking about market mechanisms, there is inevitably some kind of administrative or policy input into how they are designed. We know from experience that the way you design auctions has a lot to do with who wins them. Greg and I were just talking about this. And so I think it's not a particular point in time, but the policy implications are almost always there. And I've spent my career in and out of the FCC dealing with economists, engineers, and lawyers, and often trying to bridge the gap between the engineers who, as Evan says, are often interested in figuring out, well, how much can we cram into this one little bit of spectrum, and how should we define it really carefully so that it's in their vision of efficient use, and the economists who are always interested in a different form of efficiency. And the policymakers, they're the political appointees who often want a particular result. So I think it permeates the whole system.
So my answer is actually going to be a little bit more optimistic, because again, I'm just looking at the history, right? And if you mentioned, when Coase and people around that time were suggesting the ideas for auctioning of spectrum, my understanding is that they viewed as sort of jokers. This was not viewed as a serious potential policy proposal. And now we take all these auctions as given, and then a couple decades later we had the incentive auction where we also reallocated the supplies, determined the amount of the supplies, and then we had CBRS. So kind of my more optimistic view is that obviously there is a status quo where a lot of things are done on the administrative basis, but as long as all of us keep our eyes open and we identify new opportunities for where something can be replaced by a market mechanism, we should be sort of semi-opportunistic and make sure we don't miss them. And kind of as an economist, the way I think about this is, in order for market mechanisms to work well, what you need is some sense of competition. As soon as you have multiple potential users or multiple potential users, and they compete and they can put money in order to express how much they like option A versus option B, that's an opportunity to incorporate a market mechanism. And then inevitably some parts cannot be replaced, but hopefully as we learn more and more, we will find more and more opportunities for these types of changes.
Yeah, I got to say, I take a backseat to nobody in being pessimistic. But I wonder, Evan, and actually Greg too, when your pessimism, maybe it's in part because having been part of such an enormous leap forward, that that kind of revolution doesn't happen frequently, and usually it's just much more incremental. And and Paroma's talking about the non-market values that we haven't taken into account, which are real. So we've got to start thinking about that. And Mike's got a proposal for that, this dual auction, and that's new. And we had the incentive auctions, which were which were an improvement. So, I mean, maybe I'm turning this back to Evan. Are things really as dire as you say?
Maybe I'm just, look, I was talking to John Williams about this last week. I mean, and we were saying that maybe we've, picked the low-hanging fruit. I mean, I don't want to say that everything that could be invented has been invented. And, maybe we just have to turn it over to people like Michael, come in with new ideas. I'm certainly interested and eager to expand the role of markets. And, I'm still, trying to do that. I mean, as we talked, before this, maybe there's some scope for expanding the role of markets with satellites at some point. And so I'm always, looking for, market mechanisms, or even, but I don't have, some of the Coast insights, most of them have been implemented. So, Michael, we're counting on people like you, but part of it is you need people within the organization that have the skills and to actually look at the the details of the real problems, and try to figure out solutions that work. I mean, it's very hard. I mean, I think I see the whole process as the collaboration, among people within the organization, like economists and lawyers and engineers, and people outside of the organization, the academics like Paul Milgram and Bob Wilson and Preston McAfee and people like that. But you need people within the organization who understand the real problems and the real opportunities, and we need some more fresh blood within the agency. I mean, I worry that we're not able to attract high caliber economists, and not giving them the scope to think about these things, and to work with the engineers and the lawyers. So anyway, yes, there's maybe it has to be turned over to a new generation, but a lot of the low-hanging fruit based on COSA's insights have been implemented.
Okay, well, with that, I think our time is up. And so thank you very much to panelists. This was I thought, really interesting conversation. And this is the first in our series of Spectrum Talks, Spectrum Discussions. The next one will be a week from today on the 18th, I believe, at the same time. And in this conversation, we tried not to have discussions about which model is better, but about how to think about which models might be better. But in the next one, people can beat each other over the heads about which models are actually better, be a discussion on access. So I hope everyone will join us for that one too. So thank you to the panelists. Thank you to everyone who attended. And we'll look forward to seeing you next week. Thanks.